The Useless Hero is an Isakai audiobook. Chapter 1. The Balcony. Part 1. Scared. Eva was scared, frustrated and felt unwanted as she stood on the north-facing balcony on the central spire of Kyo Tower, the main tower of the city of Tokaya. Eva looked out beyond the wall to the assembling forces of the Demon Lord. Good Lord! Demon Lord! What a stupid name! Surely this was simply a derogatory name used by their enemies only. I cannot imagine any people calling themselves demons. But then how was she supposed to know? In this world she was like a child, with no knowledge of even the most basic facts. Eva wondered what the demon race looked like, assuming they were a separate race. She could clearly see the other races of the armies of the Demon Lord, and it was as if they were plucked out of the Lord of the Rings movie. Goblins, orcs, trolls, and a host of other unnamed beings could be seen, but at no time did she see anything which was referred to as a demon. The only clue was when she first came to the world wearing her fencing attire. After taking her fencing mask off for the first time, she was initially mistaken for a demon. It was only her blonde hair which convinced these people she was not a demon. So she wondered, what were the demon race? What did they look like? And, apart from hair colour, why did she resemble them so much? Eva sighed. There were so many questions and so few answers, and it did not help that she was considered as useless, and as a result not worthy of much attention. Something must have gone wrong with the summoning magic, which was supposed to summon a powerful hero to help the inhabitants of Tokyo defeat the Demon Lord. Instead, they only managed to retrieve a young woman, who, apart from her strange garb and look, proved to have no aptitude for magic. Actually, that was not correct. For some reason, she was able to use something which the locals called magic, but it only allowed her to affect her own body, and apart from that, was of no value. Part 2. Lack of magic. For the local women, one of the earliest magic lessons was to master the ability to monitor their own reproductive cycles, which, after a short while, Eva was able to do with ease. Eva was even able to repair damage and cure herself of some minor illnesses, such as the terrible case of deli belly she experienced after eating a salad, and she herself had prepared. She chuckled when she remembered the expressions on the faces of the local cook when she had asked for ingredients for her salad. The locals thought she was insane when she prepared her salad and mixed what looked like olive oil into it. The result was not pleasant. She was not certain if the salad harboured microbes which did not agree with her, or if there were some toxins in the plants of this world. The locals boiled everything, and now she understood why. But regardless, she was able to cure herself of a sort by making her body expel her culinary delight from every, or almost every, orifice she possessed. After that unfortunate episode, she was able to drink and eat within a few hours. The locals were impressed at how quickly she recovered, but this was tempered by Eva's stupidity in trying her experiment at all, against the advice of the cook. But apart from these minor examples of magic, she quickly hit a brick wall and proved unable to exercise any additional useful magic. It was not that she did not believe in magic, she saw it everywhere she went. It's just she did not understand how it worked. Eva suspected that was the problem. She needed to understand how it worked in order to use it. She simply had no idea where the energy came from to create the effects of magic. Heating water was an example. This was a common magic which many people could do locally. But where did the energy to heat the water come from? She had no idea, and without an understanding of the mechanics of magic, she was unable to use it herself. The locals were no help either, as they had no ideas themselves. Their answer was always it came from your mana, or essence, or spirit, none of which told her anything useful. They simply had no idea how their gift worked and used an illogical belief structure mixed in with trial and error to perform their miracles. As a result of her lack of magical ability, she was shunned by most of the inhabitants and only tolerated because of the good manners these people possessed. They summoned her and felt obliged to look after her, but that was it. Perhaps it was guilt, bringing a young woman from a strange place to a probable death, or worse. Once Eva's magic ability was assessed as worthless, she was ignored by all except for Toka and Machutsushi Noda, although she was really not sure if Noda actually tolerated her or if it was something else. Noda just wanted to be with her at all times, never speaking and never showing any emotion on her face when she was with Eva. After the disastrous attempt by Noda to give Eva knowledge of the local language, it was all Eva could do to try and do and make up for it. Part 3, the summoning. When Eva first appeared, resplendent in her fencing attire and holding her foil in a thrust, she neither spoke nor understood the local language. After the shock of seeing a young woman dressed in white with no face due to her mask, and then the shock of seeing what looked like a demon when she removed her mask, the locals probably decided they had to act quickly and teach her the local language so they could communicate. To do this, they used magic, and it was Mashutsushi Noda who did the honours. Even though Eva was in shock, she did allow this beautiful olive-skinned woman to approach her and take her hands. Then she felt a buzz in her head and grew dizzy. Before she knew it, she had collapsed and Noda was screaming in what seemed like agony. The locals were again shocked, but quickly regained their composure, took Noda away screaming and tended to Eva. Eva was still conscious but unable to move, so she was carried to a couch where two women conversed in a panicking manner. When Eva focused on these two women speaking, she discovered she could understand what they were saying, and this surprised Eva a great deal. The two women were worried that their decision to try and teach the local language so quickly may have been a mistake, but that was all Eva picked up. Being plucked from her school gymnasium into what looked like a dungeon and then discovered she was surrounded by a number of tan-skinned Asian women with platinum white hair was shocking in itself. Then suffering some kind of mental attack or strain, seeing one of the women scream in agony, then collapse to the floor, and then suddenly discovering you could understand a strange Chung was too much for one day, and Eva quickly faded away into darkness. Eva was later told Noda had been greatly affected by what the locals called a mind touch in her attempt to teach Eva the local language. After this, Noda did not speak with anyone and was always desperate to be with Eva. If she was unable to see Eva, she became agitated and started to become panicky. When she could see Eva, she calmed down and seemed normal, except she spoke with no one. No one had ever seen such a thing before, and after trying a number of spells, the medical sorceresses decided that Noda needed time to recover herself. In the meantime, Noda always stayed with Eva, another mystery to solve, except once it was decided Eva had no magic value, it was a mystery which was placed on the back burner, as the approach of the Demon Lord was far more important. Part 4. The Demon Lord. "Where do you think the Demon Lord is?" Eva asked Toka. Toka was looking to the north, straining with his eyes and finally pointing. "Lady Eva of Klagenfurt, I suspect he is on the hills of Ladenbent." He paused a moment. "I can feel his attacks are mounting, so I suspect all his magic casters are on that hill and preparing to breach our defences." Eva was doubly annoyed. Why did she tell these people she came from Klagenfurt? Now they always addressed her in that annoyingly formal manner. Eva was also annoyed she could not feel the magic, which was a reminder of a failure. While most of the inhabitants had the ability to feel magic when it was being used, no matter how slight, Eva felt nothing. Only that time she felt the buzzing when Noda conducted her disastrous mind touch. But apart from that one occurrence, the most powerful magic imagined could be occurring right next to her, and she would have no idea, unless of course it was aimed at her. But when Eva glanced at Toka, her annoyance disappeared, and she felt what could only be described as mild lust. She quickly quenched that. It was neither the time nor the place to engage in those type of activities. She realized she only had such thoughts because she was in a state of anxiety and fear. She composed herself and asked, "When do you think he will launch his main attack?" Toka's brow furled. "I expect very soon. His attacks have become rapidly increasing the last hour, so I'd expect he could break through in 1 or 2 hours. After that it will be hand-to-hand combat." Eva shivered. The Demon Lord had 10 times the soldiers, and while the cost would be high, she was told even this castle could not withstand such an attack for more than a few days. The enemy troops waited just outside the magic barrier with their ladders, ropes and siege engines. They looked eager, and if they sacked the city, it would not be without great cost to the citizens. She also reminded herself that that cost would include herself. One of the more friendly soldiers on the castle suggested Eva carry a vial of poison, and if worse came to pass, to take it. Women would be mercilessly raped before being killed, and it may be better to only offer a lifeless corpse to their tender mercies. Eva considered this, but decided against it. She knew that no matter how bad the situation was, she would not have the courage to take the poison. Eva sighed. She simply did not have the mental state of mind to live in a world such as this. While Eva was pondering this unpleasant thought, a soldier came up behind her and spoke. "Lady Eva of Klagenfurt, it will soon be too dangerous to linger here. Can I suggest you move into the shelter of the tower soon?" Part 5. The Anti-Aircraft Weapon. Eva turned around to address the commander of the ground troops, who were with what Eva thought of as an anti-aircraft weapon. There were no aircraft, but there were winged monsters, and once the magic barriers had failed, they would arrive in great numbers. Only the defending warrior sorcerers could attack them at a distance, and each balcony held one detachment with additional ground troops. The ground troops' job was to defend the sorcerer from any enemy which may materialize. When the magic barrier was down, small teams of enemy troops would be teleported to such position to eliminate any defending anti-aircraft weapon sorcerers there. The ground troops were required to stop these type of attacks. While the most powerful magic wielders were all women, the men were most effective in offensive combat magic. Those tasked with defending against airborne monsters could project deadly bolts of what looked like lightning. If one struck a monster, it would kill it outright, or injure it so badly it would fly away or crash to the ground. Without these sorcerers, the siege of Tokyo would be over in hours rather than days. Eva looked back at the sorcerer, who was seated in which looked like a large ball made of wood and metal. Its front was heavily armoured, with gaps to allow the magic lightning to pass through. It was well balanced, so the sorcerer could easily and quickly move left, right, up and down, with the power of his legs and arms. He did this by the use of pedals. This allowed his arms to remain free to cast his deadly magic. The sorcerer looked young and scared, but Eva knew he would do his duty until he died. After all, what choice did he have? Eva then stated, "Of course, Commander, we will leave immediately." Eva turned to Tokia and said, "Shall we move to the command centre now?" Tokia quickly replied, "Yes, my lady." He waited until Eva turned and walked towards the door, and then followed. Behind Tokia, Noda also followed. There was no need to tell Noda where they were going. She simply followed wherever Eva went. Chapter 2. The Command Centre. Part 1. Lord Tokunodo. Lord Tokunodo sat in his command seat. In reality, it was purely a ceremonial position. He had no practical function apart from observing the progress of the deadly battle of magic occurring outside. The command room was a large circle, the walls holding viewing portals. The sorceresses tasked with projecting views of the outside were positioned directly in front of the portals. This allowed anyone in the central raised section of the floor to easily see what was happening outside. While not necessary, if a sorceress could see where she was projecting her barrier magic, it was far more effective. Behind the viewing sorceresses sat the barrier sorceresses, whose job was to project a barrier against the enemy troops. As long as they could maintain the barrier, no enemy soldiers could pass through without an immense effort. Those few who managed to force their way through the barrier found themselves isolated and quickly killed by the troops on the wall, close behind the barrier. It took a great deal of effort maintaining the barrier, so each barrier sorceress had a backup sorceress sitting close by. The backup sorceresses were all dozing or even sleeping. It was critical they regained as much strength as they could before being required to project a barrier again. Immediately around Lord Tokunodo were the barrier sorceresses who were tasked with shielding the city from above. These seats contained the stronger sorceresses, and all the sorceresses were straining with their efforts to hold back the Demon Lord's aerial attacks. The main Demon Lord attack was against this part of the defences, and the strongest sorceresses had to be arrayed there. Lord Tokunodo turned to Machutsushi Runa, the leader of the sorceresses of Tokyo, and asked, "How long can we hold?" Machutsushi Runa faced Lord Tokunodo. "If nothing changes, 2 hours at the most." Lord Tokunodo sighed. "When we are half an hour from failure, please let our ground troops know." Machutsushi Runa nodded. She would send a mental message to all the inhabitants of Tokyo and then take her place in the last line of magic defence. She was prepared to expend her entire mana in that effort, which would probably result in her death. But that was preferable to being raped by the beasts of the Demon Lord. "Yes, my lord, it will be as you ordered," she clearly stated, before turning back to the upper screen showing the magic conflict occurring around above the city. Majutsu Shiruna was probably being optimistic as she saw all the backup barrier sorceresses were clearly exhausted and the ones projecting the barriers nearing their limits. She will have to start risking downgrading the less critical barriers to reduce the load on those sorceresses. This may allow her to use the backup sorceresses at that station elsewhere. The risk was if the Demon Lord noticed this, he could launch a massive attack against that point and cause the barrier to collapse. This would allow him to project his special teleportation troops against the aerial defenders on the balconies. It was a risk, but one she had no choice but to make. Mashutsu Shiruna remembered Eva once said to her that war is hell. It was a strange comment to make, but now she thought she understood what Eva was talking about. It also disturbed Majutsu Shiruna, as such a comment seemed to indicate a familiarity with war which most in this land did not have. Did Eva come from a war world? It was strange Runa never asked Eva if this was the case. Nonetheless, it was a question Runa was certain she would never obtain an answer for. Part 2. Lady Eva of Klagenfurt arrives. Eva arrived at the north entrance of the command centre and walked in only as far as required to view the proceedings. She did not wish to distract anyone or get in the way of anyone. Eva felt useless enough without causing any unnecessary trouble. One reason why she was resented so much was she had removed Noda from the defensive force. While Noda was not a strong barrier sorceress, she was capable of manning a position for a short period, and all possible assistance was critical. It was not her fault that they rushed to mind-touch Eva, and the contact with her mind had driven one of their sorceresses mad, but nonetheless she blamed herself. Eva was struck how this looked like a scene from a science fiction movie. Dark rooms with viewers showing the area around the city and the sky above it. In front were the operators, using their magic instead of controlling high-technology weapons in order to defend against the attack of an evil enemy. What helped the image was the sorceresses, all tan-skinned Asian women, all with platinum white hair. It was almost as if they were an alien race, which for all Eva knew may well be true. The only thing which spoiled this image was the dress of the people. They all wore what would have been suitable for medieval time, or at least what the movies thought people wore in that period. Even the Lord of the City looked like Frederick Barbarossa in a movie Eva saw as a small child. He wore chainmail, carried a long broadsword, and had a helmet close by. The sorceresses all wore white long dresses, although many were stained. They had been under attack for almost 5 days, ever since the Demon Lord had made camp and set up his magic attack command centre on the hill of Ladenbed. Eva was impressed with the organisation, viewing sorceresses, barrier sorceresses, and medical sorceresses, all in their place, straining and working hard to defend the city. The medical sorceresses were the most relaxed, but she knew that was not going to last. Eva was told near the end the sorceresses who strained too much or were strained by a sudden attack suffered serious mental damage. Many became unconscious, many went into a coma, and in the worst case they died. Those which the medical sorceresses could revive could take their place. Those who could not were carried away by the male orderlies, who were stationed outside the room close to one of the 4 entrances. Eva could see 4 of them behind her, sitting on a bench and looking very tense. Eva could hardly blame them. War was truly hell. Part 3. The Demon Lord's Sons. One of the less hostile sorceresses had told Eva that the Demon Lord had 4 sons, all of which were very powerful sorcerers. Unlike the people of Tokia, the demons possessed powerful male sorcerers, although even for the demons this was rare. The youngest son was back in the Demon Lord's capital city. With the 3 sons here, the Demon Lord himself, and with all the lesser sorceresses, the Demon Lord possessed superior magical capacity. It was estimated he had 2-to-1 advantage, which was required when on the attack in terms of medical or magical attack. In this situation, the standard strategy, if time was not an issue, was to set up an attack command centre and then to launch a constant low to medium level attack over several days. This would exhaust the defenders, so a final major attack would overwhelm them. When overwhelmed, many of the defending sorceresses would either die or fall into a deep coma. This also exhausted the attackers, but in this case the Demon Lord and his sons would launch the final overwhelming attack. The Demon Lord would still retain sufficient magical capacity to conduct some low-level magic, but the main fighting would be hand-to-hand from this point on, and it was there the Demon Lord had the greatest advantage. It was estimated his army numbered 20,000 with perhaps 200 airborne magical beasts. Against the 2,000 in the city of Tokyo, it would easily prevail. Perhaps at a high cost, and it may take a while, but the results were foregone. There was also no point in surrendering. The result would be the same: rape and death for the woman, and death for everyone else. It was the Demon Lord's intention to replace the human inhabitants of this country with his subject races, which was the whole reason for the war. Eva's bodyguard Toka blamed this on the policies of the Tokyo. In order to maintain a balance between the people and the environment, population was carefully managed. As a result, the population of Tokyo ate well and had a good life, considering the level of technology. On the other hand, no such controls existed in the Demon Lord's land. The inhabitants grew in numbers with no consideration of the carrying capability of the land. The result was predictable. Famines were common, no one had a full belly, and life was short and brutish. Because the lands of Tokyo had such a powerful force of magic wielders, the Demon Lord races could never hope to invade the rich and plentiful lands of the Tokyo, although they tried many times and were always destroyed. This acted as a horrible population control mechanism. What changed was the birth in rapid succession of powerful demon sorcerers. This dramatically changed the balance of power, and the Demon Lords were able to subjugate all the surrounding races, forming a powerful empire. It was only when the Demon Lord first attacked the lands of Tokyo and eliminated half the sorcerers of Tokyo in a single battle that the people of Tokyo really reacted. But by then it was too late. They were outnumbered, and unless they could do something unexpected, they were doomed. Eva thought to herself, it was not the first time a country ignored its neighbours because of arrogance, laziness, or a misbegotten belief in peace at any cost. Real life was a brutal war of survival against the backdrop of increasing population and finite resources. Once it was no longer possible to survive, war was a logical option. Why not? The alternative, doing nothing and starving, was not better than dying in battle. At least in battle your children may survive, while in a famine the children and all were the first to die. As a result, the people of Tokyo did nothing while the Demon Lord waged his wars of conquest, in the belief that they would be spared any invasion by the horde of starving goblins or orcs. It was true Tokyo bought peace for 5 years by doing nothing, but the cost was its destruction now at the hands of a much more powerful and strong foe. Part 4. Failed Training. While observing the operation of the command centre, Machutsushi Runa quickly noticed Eva out of the corner of her eyes, close to the door. She knew that she was responsible for the summoning of Eva. While she acknowledged she lacked warmth and friendliness, she was not totally unfriendly and did try her best at instructing Eva in the art of magic. But almost none of the questions Eva asked could she answer. Eva simply thought in a manner which made no sense and which Runa could simply not comprehend. The earliest questions Eva asked were, where did the energy for the magic come from? Machutsuji Runa was initially stumped. She wondered why anyone would ask such a question. It grew worse when Eva started spouting numbers which she claimed represented the energy that was required to warm a bowl of water, and then asked where such energy could come from. While the questions were annoying, the main reason she was so annoyed was she simply could not answer them. She did know a sorceress grew weaker as they cast magic, until they lost consciousness if they went too far. But that was all. After some rest, they would recover, and if they strained to overcome their limitation, they sometimes went into a deep coma, or in an extreme situation even died. This is all she knew, and nothing more. Then Eva asked about if there was some kind of formula which governed distance and effect, whatever that was supposed to mean. What was the range of magic, and how did range affect magic? Again, Runa had no idea. It was true some magic, such as teleportation, was affected by distance, but she had no idea what the laws, if there were any laws, behind such an effect was. The lightning attack effect of the warrior sorcerers were also governed by some kind of distance law, and Eva managed to calculate the distance effect of this weapon. No one else had ever done this in the past. In only a few days, Eva managed to provide the warrior sorcerers a detailed description of what effect their bolts had based on their range. The warrior sorcerers were pleased, and they took special note of this. But just as Machutsu Shuruna, the warrior sorcerers had no understanding of how Eve had done this. All they knew was in the tests they conducted, Eva's numbers were correct. And of all the inhabitants of Tokyo, they proved to be the most friendly towards Eva, especially after this. Eva even assisted them in creating some form of device which allowed them to determine the range to their target, which again was something that had never ever been done in the past. Machutsu Shiruna remembered that Eva was surprised that the laws she calculated did not follow some kind of inverse law, and followed some law Eva called kinetic or something along that line. In the face of such questions, Machutsu Shiruna felt stupid and hopeless, but she did hope that this was a prediction of a powerful magic capability. Alas, she was wrong. Eva was unable to execute even the simplest magic casts, such as heating water. She kept on focusing on where the energy came from instead of just doing the casting like all the other sorcerers had done in history. At one stage, Machutsu Shuruna considered another mind touch, but after what occurred with Machutsu Shunoda, she was not going to risk any more of her scarce sorceresses, so she dismissed that course of action immediately. Her frustration was intense, and she was afraid she did take it out on Eva, who was surely not to blame. After all, she was plucked from her world to a strange new world and asked to assist total strangers. It was astounding that Eva made the efforts that she did, but in the end it was to no avail. Her attempts to learn magic resulted in no benefits and cost the people of Tokyo a valuable sorceress in their attempt to teach Eva the local language. Her guilt intensified even further when she remembered what plan she had for Eva. It was decided Eva would act as bait for some of the valuable demon transportation troops or teleportation troops. At least there would be one less team of enemy soldiers who were not available to attack the more valuable target. She did not tell Eva of the plan, but she knew Eva was aware of it nonetheless. Realizing she could not waste any more time in idle thoughts, she once again focused on the main north viewer and started monitoring the barrier sorceresses. Part 5. Move to safety. Eva watched for what may have been an hour when Tokyo tapped her on the shoulder. "Lady Eva of Klagenfurt, we should move below. It will be safer," Tokyo stated. Eva thought that the safety was an illusion, but it was better she moved down regardless. She was of no benefit here, and she knew she would play a minor part in the defence of the city if she moved below as planned. Eva knew that while she had no value, the demon lord knew of her summoning, and while he was not aware she had no magic capability, he may decide to target her. She was an unknown quantity, and a wise commander would remove unknown factors from the playing area, especially if that commander was winning. It was possible the demon lord would launch a sudden attack in one sector of the defences, overwhelm it and transport some assassins into the castle. As the defences were getting weaker, the chance of this increased. She turned and followed Toka, who in turn was followed by Noda. As Noda followed, she stopped for a moment and looked back, before turning around again and following Eva. Machutsu Shiruna noticed Noda and wished she was able to assist the defences. She also noticed Noda looked at the west screen. She wondered why. Could she see something? Machutsu Shiruna turned to the west screen but could see nothing unusual. When she turned back, Noda was gone. She wondered what was it that Noda had seen, or was it a premonition? Machutsu Shiruna decided to check on the west screen on a regular basis. Even if there was no real reason to do so, she had a bad feeling. Chapter 3. The Bunker. Part 1. Entering the bunker. Eva walked in what she called the bunker, or in her native language, debunker. The locals were puzzled by this description, as a bunker was a hole in the ground covered by logs and dirt. At least it was in this land. But to Eva it reminded her of a movie she saw in her old world, which she thought was called Debunker. It was the last days of Hitler, and she found it a very depressing and disturbing movie, as she found this a bunker in turn. What Eva called a bunker was a medium-sized room of stone, deep underground. The locals called it a shelter, for that was its purpose. Inside were her guards, 6 men along with Toko, who she had brought. She suspected if Noda was not also here, it would have been less, but perhaps she was being paranoid. The room had seats built along both opposing walls. The wall at the far end of the entrance contained a seat in the wall and a desk. The room was lit by a number of burning braziers rather than magic. Using magic to light a room such as this was not considered a high priority. Even the command centre relied on its viewing portals for most of its lights. The lack of lighting was one aspect of this world which did depress Eva. She was not used to such a gloomy environment. While she had got somewhat used to this, it still weighed down on her mood. The soldiers, 3 on each side of the room, sat on the benches, cleaning their weapons, eating, or in one case sleeping. Until they received a warning a barrier had been breached, there was nothing to worry about. At least that's what she was told. In reality, she was constantly worried, and probably for good reasons. One thing she'd really noticed was the lack of what you would call logical thought in many of the local people. While it was true Tokyo had managed a rare feat of sustainability, this was more due to the religion than any logical thought concerning the consequences of overpopulation. Even the unsustainable population growth in the demon lord's land was generally blamed on the ignorance or stupidity of the inhabitants rather than the actual unsustained population growth. However, Eva knew if the peoples of that land were truly that stupid, they would not be besieging Tokyo now. It was another sign of the arrogance of those who, by luck, good planning or hard work, had achieved something and then considered all those who were not equally conducting the same wise activity as somehow inferior or stupid. While this could be the case in many situations, in others it was certainly not. Eva then remembered a story about the Roman emperors when they were carried through the streets of Rome during a triumph. They were supposed to have a slave in the chariot that kept on repeating, "You are not a god," in order to remind the emperor that being on top was not a guarantee of a future success. Based on the history of the empire, being on top often led to an early death. As the paranoid would often say, being paranoid does not mean someone is not out there ready to get you. A sad philosophy, but looking at the situation Eva was in now, very apt. Part 2. Do not worry, my love. Eva looked at Tokyo, who looked nervous. Eva grabbed his hand and whispered, "Do not worry, my love." Tokyo, as well as being the only friend she had, was also her lover. Eva was not certain if she loved him, but she considered him as her only friend and was very grateful for this. Eva remembered the first time she slept with him. Little did she realize it was his first time, and he was even more nervous than he was now. Initially, Tokyo resisted Eva's advances, claiming that if he bed her, it would affect her magic. She laughed at him and said if being a virgin was required as a sorceress, then she was really out of luck. He was really shocked at that statement, and when she followed up with, "If you don't sleep with me now, I will simply masturbate myself to sleep. I need some relief from the tension," he was shocked senseless. However, once she undressed and stimulated his private parts with her mouth, there was no resistance. His lack of experience was disappointing, but what Eva really wanted was someone to hold, and Tokyo served that purpose more than adequately. Eva was not sure Tokyo loved her, but she suspected he was infatuated with her nonetheless. After all, she was an exotic woman, tall, solid, with blonde hair, and looked like a demon. What could be more exotic? In turn, Tokyo was as exotic to Eva as she was to him. He was at least 182 centimetres tall, which was the same height as Eva. He was strong, with what would be called a hard body. He lacked a six-pack, but his body was as hard as stone nonetheless. Like most of the people here, he had a light brown complexion and was clearly Asian. Thinking about it, he looked Japanese or perhaps Korean. He was a joy in bed eventually, but what Eva really appreciated was his friendship. When all the others who tried so hard to develop her magic abandoned her, Tokyo remained, and Eva appreciated that. "I'm not nervous for myself, I fear for your safety," Tokyo stated in all seriousness. "I will most certainly die defending you, but I fear greatly for what will happen to you afterwards." Eva was also fearful for that time as well, but she did not wish Tokyo to see that. "Do not worry, I will be all right. Just ensure that you do not die." This did not reassure Tokyo, but he obviously had nothing else to say that would not make the situation worse. Eva found the conservative moral code of this land interesting at first, but then suspected that in order to control the population as effectively as they did, it was important to keep sex in its place. On the other hand, the ability of women to control their reproductive cycle was possibly the main reason why the population was so well controlled. It had certainly helped Eva. Eva had been in this land for just 6 months, and if she was not able to do this herself, she was certain she would have been pregnant by now. Considering she was almost certainly doomed, this would have been morally wrong, at least in Eva's mind. While the locals had very strict moral codes concerning courting and sex, their morality concerning children was in some ways shocking to Eva. Any child born with a deformity was quickly and painlessly killed. When Eva first heard of this, she was deeply disturbed and wondered what type of people she was with. While she learned to live with this, after all, what choice did she have? She still felt it was repugnant. She understood the logic, quality of life against quantity, and she was a strong supporter of the right of women to choose to abort a fetus. But killing a child which was born was a line Eva was not prepared to cross. In actuality, most children were aborted in the mother's womb when a problem was detected, and the medical sorceresses were very effective in this. But some people could not believe their child had a problem and insisted for it to be born. Rarely, if ever, were the medical sorceresses wrong, and while the locals terminated the life of the child quickly, they still mourned for the loss of a life. There were special cemeteries for these children who had been aborted in the womb or after birth, and the cemeteries were well visited. Eva found it hard to understand, but once remembered someone tell her you should never force your moral standards on another culture, unless of course they were harming a third party. After all, what you may consider as acceptable today may be considered as repugnant in the future. Morality was often very subjective. Part 3. The Attack. Eva, Tokyo and Noda moved across the room to the table. As Eva walked, she was reminded about the total inadequate undergarments of this world. When she had first arrived, she tried the local clothing and found the undergarments unbearably uncomfortable. Made of something which resembled cotton but seemed much rougher. The colour was not white but a light brown, and she had to tie a cord around her waist to keep them from falling down. Like men's pyjamas back home. This was bulky and uncomfortable, and she quickly reverted to her only pair of underwear. Unfortunately, after 6 months of constant wear, with daily washing in the evening before she retired, the garment was beginning to fall apart. The elastic was the first part which began to fail, and after, in shock discovering her underwear were beginning to drop, she wore a dress. She was forced into wearing the local equivalent eventually. After the locals had stopped making the effort to train her in magic, she decided she would modify the local undergarments to make something more comfortable. While she had some minimal success, the lack of anything which was elastic in nature made the creation of comfortable and possibly sexy undergarments basically impossible. Once again she was suffering from what her mother called hungry bum, and she walked in an unusual manner in order to free the offending piece of cloth. She was even beginning to consider creating a G-string, which she did not enjoy wearing at home. But at least once she got used to the string, it was reasonably comfortable. Once again, another project which she was certain she would never complete. It was then that Noda spoke for the first time in more than 6 months. West Barrier failure, watch for intruders. Eva had never heard Noda speak, so she was quite shocked at this, but more shocked about the West Barrier failure. All the guards tensed and drew their sword. At that moment 6 shapes appeared in the room. All were what Eva thought looked like men in black garb, or should I clarify, normal European men in black garb. They all had jet black hair, but were as pale as Eva. One stood before Eva. He looked at Eva in surprise. Quickly recovering, the intruder then shouted, "We have the prisoner here, kill everyone else." At that moment Tokia struck the man with his sword, piercing his stomach. The sword must have hit an artery as the blood gushed from the wound like a river. The man had a look of surprise and collapsed. The victory was short-lived as another man struck Tokia in the head with an axe. All the intruders carried axes, which were ideal as short-range weapons in a confined space. Tokia tried to turn, but then collapsed, his head crushed. The man looked at Eva, turned and continued to fight with the remaining guards. Tokia clutched at Eva's dress as he descended, while Eva stood in shock. Her dress was covered with the blood of the slain assassin and Tokia's blood. She reached down to Tokia, but all she could see was his ruined head. She could even see parts of the brain in his ruined skull. She wanted to vomit. Eva wanted to be sick. She fell to her knees and placed her hands on Toka's ruined head. "Toka," she softly murmured. She dropped her head. The tears began to fall. She was now left friendless in a strange land. The feeling of isolation and abandonment began to overwhelm Eva, and the true horror of the situation finally began to come home to roost. While being plucked into a strange land from her home was a shock, Eva had initially treated it as some kind of adventure, feeling in her heart everything would be okay in the long term. Yes, she had her disappointments, her setbacks, but each day was filled with new exciting sights, sounds, ideas and thoughts. She may not have been happy, but she was fully occupied in an attempt to understand her new world. Eva was a problem solver. Give me a problem and she could not help but try and solve it, even to the exclusion of more pressing priorities, such as catching the tram back home. Only her loneliness was unbearable, and Toka's love, or at least lust, for Eva had satisfied that need. Now Toka was gone. She was alone, isolated, and would soon die or worse. Eva thought, as she looked down at her beloved, but now dead Toka, that she should be afraid, but something else was occurring. Among the shock and sadness, a core of defiance. No, perhaps it was better to call it hatred, grew and grew, until it almost overpowered her. She raised her head and looked at the remaining assassins fighting the remaining 4 guards. She knew it would not be long before they completed their grisly job, after which they would turn towards Eva and Noda to complete their grisly mission. But Eva was not scared. She was not worried. She was instead a living embodiment of hatred. "How dare you, she muttered. "You will pay," Eva finally spoke. Part 4. Magic. Noda now said for a second time, "West's barrier restored," after which Eva turned to Noda, who was also staring back. Noda then followed this statement with, "What will you do now?" Eva turned towards the enemy soldiers, with hate in her heart and in her head, and suddenly it all became clear. Through the raw, overwhelming hatred, her brain had found the key. She now understood where the energy came from, for the magic, and she now understood what she could do with it, or at least she thought she could, and in a stroke of astonishing luck, she was correct. Through her eyes, filled with hate, she visualized the atoms in the head of the enemy, and with a tug caused their normal, random Brownian motion to convert into a single movement in a single direction. The result was stunning. The men's head exploded in a gush of blood and brains. She quickly moved to the next intruder and repeated the magic, and the next, and killed the last just when he realized something was wrong, as his comrades lay dead around him. The floor of the shelter was soaked with blood and the brains of the 5 intruders. Eva looked vainly around to see if he could find another target. She wanted to kill, but failing to find a target for her wrath, she turned to her next task. Noda was shocked. She had never seen magic of this type before. She had no idea what it was, no idea how anyone could defend against it. It was something totally new. She always knew Eva had the ability of magic within her, but something was holding her back. She also knew the evil within Eva's head. She had seen things of such terror in the mind of Eva, she had screamed in terror herself. Now she understood what that evil could do, and it was as terrible and horrible as she expected. Noda wanted to be sick. She wanted to cry. She wanted to flee, but knew she could not. Her fate was in her own hands, and she had to bravely face it. Eva had bent over Toka and was glowing across her entire body with some kind of magic energy. Almost, Noda had never seen such a force, such a blinding light come from an entire human body. Not even the demon lord could come close to this. Then she realised what Eva was doing. She was repairing Toka. "No, do not do this, Eva," she shouted, grabbing Eva. Eva looked back with a cold look. "Stay out of this," Eva growled. Noda, in terror, had to explain. "You do not understand. If you restore him, you'll be left with a mindless idiot. Is that what you wish? The brain is damaged. While you can repair it, you can never replace the memories." Eva paused, turned back to Tokyo. Her hands clutched in frustration and anger, and then they released their tight grip. She looked back at Toka and realised that Toka was dead forever. Noda was right. Eva wanted to scream in frustration. She now wanted revenge. She wanted vengeance more than ever before. At that moment, a message from Central Command came through to Noda. 30 minutes to failure, the ominous words stated. Noda looked at Eve and said, "Even if you bring me back to life in 30 minutes, we will all be dead." Noda thought Eva was about to argue. It would be what she would do, but instead Eva's face had a pained expression. She turned back to Toka and smashed her fist down into the bloody floor, splattering the blood across both Eva and Noda. "Scheist, scheist, scheist," she kept on repeating. Noda had no idea what she was saying, but she could hear the pain in Eva's voice. After a moment, Eva sighed, composed herself, and without facing Noda said, "You are correct." She stood up, looking at the body of Toka as she rose. Noda saw a drop of water fall from her cheek. Eva was thinking. Her brain was a blaze of hate, pain, sadness, and thought. Most certainly thought. As if her brain was moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, thinking of what to do next. She had to destroy the demon lord, not to save the city, but to avenge Toka. That was all that was in her mind. She had to have vengeance against the monster who had taken her only friend and lover and left her a friendless and lonely person as anyone could ever possibly be. Eva cared little for what it would cost her. The demon lord would pay, and pay dearly. Part 5. Return to the balcony. Eva was uncertain what she would do, but understood that she had to put herself in a place where she could see her enemy. In all probability, she had to see the results of her magic in order for it to work, or at least the location of where the magic was to occur. She looked at the stairs. It would take at least 20 minutes to get to the balcony, if not more. By then it would be too late. She looked at the slain assassins and realised they had teleported in this room, in which case she should be able to teleport herself to the balcony. The issue was how to do it. First, Eva thought of creating a wormhole in the location and the balcony and linking them, but dismissed that as that would require a gravitational force of a black hole, and quite frankly Eva didn't fully understand how to do it anyway. Next she thought about quantum mechanics, linking all the atoms in a body with random atoms in the balcony, and then swapping the atoms simultaneously. However, she was unsure if that was even possible, or if it would kill her. She looked at Noda. The locals could do it. Perhaps Noda could as well. Eva then turned to Noda and spoke. "I need to get to the balcony now, and I do not have the time to work out how to create a wormhole or to use quantum mechanics to transport myself. Can you take me to the balcony now?" Noda paused. She had no idea what a wormhole was or what quantum mechanics was, but she had seen those concepts in Eva's mind, but had no understanding of them. Noda shivered in fear, and then, with Eva accepting the death of Toka so quickly, in relief nodded. She had expected to be forced to argue with Eva, and she knew she was in no position to force Eva to do anything. Noda then grabbed Eva and focused on the balcony which she had so recently been. Transporting two people, even such a short distance, was beyond her normal capability, but fear and panic was a powerful motivator. After a moment she locked into the desired location and managed to transport both of them. However, this was beyond her normal capability, and when she arrived at the balcony she collapsed in exhaustion. But before she blacked out, she could see the balcony was a battleground. "Oh no, now what have I done?" Noda thought. and then there was blackness and most likely a coma or possibly death. Chapter 4. Return to the balcony. Part 1. The battle on the balcony. When Eva and Noda materialized on the balcony, Noda collapsed. The strain of teleporting two bodies, even though it was only a short distance, was far too much for Noda. This was not her speciality, and it was unusual that she possessed the ability at all. Noda, many years ago, decided to learn as many spells as possible, with the result she was master of none. Eva grabbed Noda as she collapsed and slowly let Noda down to the floor, after which she quickly checked her pulse. With relief, she realized Noda was still alive, but only barely. She noticed Noda was very cold, much colder than would ever be expected for a normal person, and then wondered if Noda used the thermal energy of a body to perform magic. Eva had originally considered this when she had first arrived, but felt the body's own thermal energy was not sufficient to perform any meaningful magic. She thought that it was what made it possible to conduct the minor magic on her own body that she was capable of, but she simply could not see how the body's thermal energy could boil water. As a result, she considered it impossible. Perhaps she was wrong. Perhaps that's where the energy came from. Eva had found another energy source, which she knew worked and which Eva knew made logical sense. Eva shook her head. No time to worry about that right now. She then gently used her newfound skill and raised the body temperature of Noda until Noda stirred slightly. Then she heard a scream behind her. When Eva turned around, she saw a group of Demon Lord troops fighting the troops left on the balcony. There were 10 of them fighting, with 2 lying in a pool of blood. But their skill was great, and they had already killed or injured half the defending troops. In the dungeon, she had killed each Demon Lord individually, willing the random actions of atoms in each head to move in a single direction. She decided to see if she could do this with more than one target. Focusing, she imagined all 10 demon soldiers, their heads and the atoms which randomly moved around within them. With a slight effort, all 10 soldiers' heads exploded in a gush of blood and brains, and they collapsed. Part 2. The healing. The defending soldiers looked at their foes in shock, probably wondered what had occurred. Eva noticed the sorcerer in the bull mount was injured. She could not risk an enemy mounting an attack by air if the barriers collapsed. Eva quickly rushed over the surviving group of soldiers and coming up next to the sorcerer in his bull mount. She saw an axe had hit the side of his body and blood was everywhere. The sorcerer had the good sense to hold his wound tight, which reduced the flow of blood. Eva saw the sorcerer was alive, but racked in pain. She focused on the wound and saw the torn cells. Like with Toka, she began to repair them as fast as she could. Within what could only be minutes, the wound was gone, and the sorcerer's face changed from pain to a surprised look. Luckily, the sorcerer had not lost too much blood and was still conscious. The sorcerer looked down at the wound that was no longer there and then looked back up to Eva. "My lady, I thank you. I not know how you healed me so quickly," he stated. Then he smiled. "You are truly like a goddess, saviour, and I thank thee." Eva was surprised at his words. They seemed so friendly. Only Tokia addressed her with so much warmth. Her steel core of hatred wavered slightly, but then strengthened again as she remembered the fate of Tokia and her personal pain. "Are you able to defend the balcony from flying beasts?" Eva quickly stated. The male sorcerer blinked and felt the place his wound was. Then he looked forward and sent a weak test lightning bolt out. It was faint, but it was a test. This was what was expected. The sorcerer looked back at Eva. "Yes, my lady, I am able to defend the balcony and yourself with my life if necessary." Eva felt relieved. "Good," and turned around to walk back to Noda. The ground troops were tending their own wounded, and some were adjusting their weapons. Eva noticed one man screaming in pain with his hand severed off. Another was applying a tourniquet to the arm, but it was clear he was out of the battle. It was then Eva was struck how this injured man looked like Tokia. Her heart ached again. She walked over to him and saw the severed hand next to the man. She thought, "I wonder if I could repair his arm." Eva focused on the wound and after a moment realized it was simply too complex. It was one thing to bind torn cells together. It was another to join nerves and bones. Perhaps she could grow a hand back using stem cells. After a moment she had an idea and focused on the injured soldier's spine until she located a stem cell. Focusing on the cell, she then duplicated it in another cell and checked the result. Yes, they were identical. She was able to create stem cells. She then looked at the soldier applying the tourniquet and quickly said, "Pick up the hand and place it next to the stump. Make sure they are touching. Hold down the arm. Make sure you are not touching the wound or the severed hand. I will try and repair the damage." The soldier looked up in puzzlement. This was something he'd never heard of. But then, he was but a simple soldier, and the lady was clearly one of the powerful sorceresses of the tower, although she did look like a demon, which did concern him. But after seeing what she had done, he obeyed. Once the hand was in place, Eva then proceeded to convert all the cells on the stump, the hand and all the blood into stem cells. She then formed the bloody mess into a ball where the hand was, or should have been, and dramatically accelerated the metabolic processes of the stem cells. This increased the heat of the cells, so she was careful to ensure this did not damage the cells. She was hoping they would form the correct cells based on their neighbouring cells, and she was not disappointed. The hand slowly grew for the stump until it was a full pinkish hand. Eva then thought how simple this was. If this was magic, this was easier than she ever originally thought. Although the magic itself was something that defied complexity, it was her knowledge which made it easy. The injured man stopped screaming, blinking, and then looked at his hand. He was still in shock, so he could not speak, but remained transfixed by his whole hand. She faced the soldier who was holding the arm down. "You can release him and attend to the other wounded." Eva had no time to attend them herself. She had a demon lord to deal with. Part 3. The Mind Touch. Eva moved back to Noda, who was beginning to raise herself. She bent down and helped Noda to her feet. "Are you all right, Noda?" Eva quickly said. "Yes, I am. It was just more strain than I'm used to." Eva then turned to the hill where the demon lord resided. How to deal with him, Eva thought. Without looking, she spoke. "Noda, how long do you think we have?" Noda thought for a moment and said 20 minutes at the most. Eva's brain then raced. She initially thought about splitting the water vapour into oxygen and hydrogen above the demon lord and then igniting it. However, she felt that the demon lord would be able to place a shield around his position which would nullify its effect. Then she thought about a fission explosion, but was unsure how to create enough radioactive material in thin air. The same applied with fusion explosion. The energy required to create it was probably too great, especially at this distance. Every idea was defeated by a simple issue: how to create the material required above the demon lord which would destroy him. It required too much thought and energy, and she was rapidly running out of time. Then she had an idea. It was so simple and so brilliant, it could not possibly work. But perhaps it could. If Eva could move atoms around in a man's head with minimal effort, why not swiftly swap the electrons and positrons in some atoms of air? The result would be obviously rather impressive. She did a quick calculation. An explosion the size of Nagasaki would be, as she calculated, how much air was there to convert to do that. The explosion would reach as far as the city, so she needed a shield. The shields the locals used had the ability of stopping something physical. If she could only understand how the spell worked, she could create a single shield around the city to protect it against the blast effect of her possible bomb. She turned to Noda. "I need to know how to cast a shield spell. Can you teach it to me, as you did your language?" Noda shivered at the thought. "If you mean a barrier spell, yes, I can do this." Her voice clearly showed the fear and panic she was feeling. Then Eva remembered what happened last time and placed her hand on Noda's arm. "Are you sure you are all right? I do not wish to drive you further into madness." Noda was strangely comforted by Eva's move. While Noda had seen pure evil in the mind of Eva, which caused her great fear and shock, it was what Noda did next which caused her personal disaster. The evil that she saw was so shocking that Noda instinctively reacted and threw a mental spell of such power at Eva it would have destroyed the mind of anyone, even a powerful sorceress. Yet Eva, after a moment of shock, reacted with such power and strength that Noda's mind was infected instead. Noda had no idea how Eva had done this, but she had. It was this that made her realize Eva had magic powers far in excess of anyone she was aware of, and it was this reason why she always wanted to be with Eva. If she saw Eva's true power raised against her nation, she was prepared to attack Eva again, as the evil she saw in Eva's mind compelled her to do so. But Eva, for some reason, was unable to cast any magic. Something held her back, and Nodda continued to watch and slowly began to understand that while Eva's mind was filled with evil, her actions were those of a good person. Nodda was confused, but continued to watch Eva. Nodda sighed, and then clearly stated, "No, I am prepared this time and will not collapse as I did last time." While Nodda would make sure she would not be struck by her own magic, she still shuddered at the evil that she imagined she would see in the mind of Eva, and hoped it would not pollute her mind. "I will endure," Nodda muttered. Eva then thought about her own weakness after the last mind touch. "Last time I lacked strength after your mind touch. Can you do this without causing that?" Nodda noted, "You're only weak because I made an error. I will not do this again, and it should have no effect." Nodda knew Eva's weakness was caused by her mental attack, or at least the small part which had got through before Eva brushed it aside as if someone would brush aside a fly. "In that case, proceed quickly. I need to make sure I can protect the city when I destroy the demon lord." Nodda was momentarily puzzled. She had thought Eva was simply going to bolster the defences of the city with the barrier spell. How would destroying the demon lord require Eva to use a barrier spell to defend the city? The demon lord was at least 8 kilometres away. "Take my hand as you did before," Nodda stated. Then both she and Eva felt the dizziness, but no weakness occurred. Nodda was another story. She was preparing for the onslaught of evil she felt before and was puzzled it did not occur. Could she have made an error before? All she could see were writing on what appeared to be a white surface. Small balls made up of even smaller balls floated around the white surface. The positions of the smaller balls moved around in what seemed like a purposeful move or form. Then she was hit with a wall of knowledge, atoms, formulas, E equals mc squared, and more than she could possibly bear. Yet none of this knowledge made any sense. To Nodda it all seemed like gibberish, yet she knew it was not. And then at the end she saw the evil which she saw before, a vision of a high mushroom-shaped cloud reaching to the sky. Nodda clutched her hands and sucked her breath in. "I must endure for a moment longer. I must endure for a moment longer," she mumbled. And then it ended. Part 4. The Fireball. Eva blinked several times and then she smiled. "That's how it works. Duplicating the strong atomic forces which kept the atoms together. Very clever. I wonder how your people ever came up with the idea. If it was trial and error, it must have taken a long time," Eva spluttered. While Eva thought and made her statement, she saw that Nodda was still shaken by the mind touch. "Nodda, are you all right? Snap out of it. We have so little time." Eva had grabbed Nodda's shoulders and was shaking her. "It's okay. I just need to pull myself together," Nodda spluttered. Once Eva was satisfied Nodda was thinking and rational, she then gave her instructions. "Can you send a telepathic warning to everyone in the city?" Nodda did not understand what telepathic meant, but she did answer, "I have the power to send a mental message to all those who could receive it," which was most of the medium to high-level magic users. "Is that sufficient?" Eva nodded, yes. She continued, "When I say the word mark, send a message to everyone that on a count of 30, do not look to the north for a count of 10, otherwise you will be blinded. Repeat this as many times as you can, reducing the time accordingly." Nodda thought for a moment and nodded. "When the count of 30 is done, then send another message telling everyone to take cover from what may be a strong wind from the north. Do you understand? This is important, otherwise our people will be hurt or killed." Nodda nodded. "Good." Eva turned around to face the demon lord. "When I say mark, start your communication." Eva waited for a few seconds and then shouted, "Mark." Nodda sent her message, repeating it 3 times before she herself turned around as instructed. Eva was very careful to ensure she closed her eyes and then turned around once she had started the reaction. while muttering, "And Lord said, let there be light, and there was light," after which hell itself descended upon the world. Part 5. Hell on Earth. Nora was facing the tower when she saw the reflection in the dark stone tower walls. A reflection of a great light, brighter than she'd ever seen before. Was the stone emitting light? No, that could not be. It must be a reflection. What kind of light could cause this type of reflection from a stone wall? It must be unfathomable. She waited for a count of 10 and turned around. She at first could not understand what she saw, although it reminded her slightly of the mushroom cloud she saw in the mind of Eva. But the size! This cloud must have been 10 kilometres high and several kilometres wide at the base, and it was rising upwards and towards her rapidly. In the moment that she thought this, the cloud had doubled in size. What was she seeing? Nora simply could not comprehend, and then her vision blurred and darkened. She did not understand what was happening at first, but when it had become totally black, she realised this was the effect of the most powerful barrier spell she had ever witnessed. You could create a small round ball using a barrier spell, which was impenetrable to anything, but it took an immense effort. This ball covered the entire city, several hundred metres beyond the city shield. The only light was that created by the city itself, which was not much. Then she saw lights, small lights. This was outside of her comprehension, and then she realised what was happening. The shield was now a perfect mirror. She could clearly see a fire heating a cauldron of oil on the city wall reflected in the shield about 200 metres away. It took effort to confirm, but as the flames licked around, so did the light in the shield. This was something she had never, ever seen before. Eva was stunned. Scheist. Was hab ich gemacht? She muttered in a panicked manner. Eva had miscalculated. This was an antimatter explosion, not a fusion explosion. The power output was many times greater than she had planned. While she was looking at the explosion, once it had begun, she realised her mistake. She was hurriedly calculating what the actual effect would be. It was more than 100 megatons, could even be 1,000 megatons. Scheist, she thought. What would the effect be? She tried to remember the effect of the Soviet Tsar bomb, but could not remember the details. If it was going to be that bad, she quickly brought up the shield wall as hard as she could until it was pitch black. Then she felt the initial effects and increased the shield strength again until it was a perfect mirror. The blast effect was hitting her shield with enormous force, and she held. How long, she thought, and then it began, a throbbing pain, which increased with every second. Please, no, she thought, please, hold on. But the pain was so great. Eva understood what the pain was, because she understood where the energy for her magic came from, at least the type of energy that she was using. It came from the annihilation of matter from the spellcaster, or at least that's how she understood it. She was able to control what part of the body was annihilated, and quickly ran out of dead skin and other useless parts of her body. It was now eating away into her flesh. The pain increased and increased until she could feel or bear the pain no more. Just a while longer, she thought. It would take at least 10 minutes before the worst of the blast had passed, and she had to hold on in order to protect the city from the radiated heat. What an idiot, she thought. What a stupid idiot she was. How could she make such a mistake? She had obliterated the Demon Lord, his army and everything for at least 20 kilometres in all directions. Would the hill be a sheet of glass? Unlikely, she thought. The ground contained no sand and was just dirt and granite. It would be a pool of molten granite, she expected, and made cool into a smooth surface. She was uncertain. The surrounding land, up to at least 20 kilometres in all directions, would be cleared of all life and left radiating heat. She hoped that the land around the city would cool rapidly, if it was not under the actual blast radius, so she hoped the ground would not absorb that much heat. Nora was gazing at the wondrous mirrored barrier, but was distracted by Eva falling to the ground, writhing in pain. What had happened? She quickly went to Eva and, using her medical magic, analysed her. She could find nothing wrong, but knew Eva was in terrible pain. It was then she noticed one of Eva's feet were missing. There was no blood, just a stump. She could not understand what was happening, but now realised this was what was causing Eva her pain. All she could do was attempt to dull the pain, and this quickly worked, and Eva's writhing and subsided. Eva was still in pain as she consumed her own body to maintain the shield, but the pain became bearable. Eva could barely mutter to Noda, "When my shield wall fails, tell everyone to take cover. The heat will be intense and will cause fires," Eva mumbled. Noda complied and sent the message. Eva struggled to say, I need to maintain the shield for at least another 9 minutes. I'm not sure I can do it." Noda placed her hand on Eva's brow. "Is there anything else I can do?" she said. Eva's face twisted with pain and then relaxed. "If you can help me with my pain, just keep it up. I can't afford to lose consciousness." Noda nodded. As the minutes passed, more and more of Eva's body disappeared. Noda found the sight horrific. How could she even imagine Eva was evil? Here she was sacrificing herself to help her people. Considering we plucked her from her own home for our own selfish purposes, she was still willing to do this. Noda felt ashamed of her earlier thoughts and kept up the pain relief spell as parts of Eva disappeared in front of her eyes. After 8 minutes, Noda sent her last warning. Only Eva's head remained and what looked like part of her spine. Eva looked at Noda and tried to speak, but lacked the ability. She lacked lungs. She smiled and then disappeared. But Noda thought her mind say, "Well, that was one crummy Isakai." Noda had no idea what Eva meant, nor why she used such an ancient word. But when she disappeared, the shield disappeared. Chapter 5. The Defenders. Part 1. The screens blazed. Lord Tokunodo looked at the straining sorceresses around her. Most lay collapsed and unconscious in their chairs. Only the viewing sorceresses and the remaining barrier sorceresses remained conscious, and he felt they would not remain so for long. He had to move to prepare for the ground attack. As he rose, one of the barrier sorceresses screamed and collapsed. The east barrier was down and there was no one left to assist. This was it, he thought, and he rapidly moved to the door so he could be with his ground troops when he heard the mental warning. On a count of 30, do not look to the north for a count of 10, otherwise you will be blinded. Lord Tokunodo had no idea what that meant. The north was the location of the Demon Lord. Was the Demon Lord preparing an even more terrible attack, and this was a warning from someone? Please, no, please let that not be the case, he thought, as he started counting down. Lord Tokunodo decided to wait. 30 seconds was not too long, and while one barrier was down, the rest would hold on for at least another 5 minutes. The warning reached him 2 more times. None of the remaining barrier sorceresses took any notice. They were all straining to hold the barrier and had their hands full. Only the medical and screen sorceresses heard the messages, and they too knew not what it meant. Then at a count of 0, the screens blazed in a sheet of the most intense white light Lord Tokunodo had ever seen, after which they all went black. 2 of the sorceresses were screaming, my eyes," and several medical sorceresses quickly attended them. All the barrier sorceresses had stopped. Without a view, they were unable to keep the barrier up. The barriers are down, screamed one sorceress. We need the screens to get the barriers up, another sorceress screamed in reply. Only then, the barrier sorceresses, which were so exhausted that nothing could earlier wake them, suddenly stirred to life and stared at the much darker room. Lord Tokunodo heard all of them speak almost as once, and could only make out, what had happened, or is this the end? Lord Tokunodo quickly thought, was it a weapon? But why wait now to use it? Get the screens up, he shouted. Then he heard another message. If outside, take cover. Who was sending these messages, he thought. But first he had to get the screens and barriers up. 1, and then 2, and then all but 2 screens came up, and what he saw shocked him. It was dark, totally black. Has something gone wrong with the viewing screens, he shouted. No, my lord, except for the north and the west screens, they are all operating normally, shouted back Matsuchu Shiruna, who had only just regained her senses. Soon 2 new screen sorceresses replaced those who were blind, and they were also operating as well. "It's all black." "Wait, I can see some lights," shouted one of the medical sorceresses. Lord Tokunodo strained, and he too could see some lights, scattered around the viewers, and they all flickered as if they were fires. Nothing made any sense. If this was a new weapon, why were they still all alive? And why was there nothing but darkness outside, apart from these flickering lights? Lord Tokunodo turned to Matsusu Shiruna, who was still seated in one of the 4 positions closest to the command chair, and asked, "Do you know what has happened?" Matsusu Runa turned around to face Lord Tokunodo and shook her head. She then turned back to stare at the blackness in one of the screens on the side of the command centre. Part 2, a new barrier. "Can you get the shields up?" Lord Tokunodo shouted. At that moment, Matsusu Shiruna interrupted. "There is no need, my lord. We are seeing a barrier which is protecting our city." Lord Tokunodo looked down at Matsusu Shiruna and said, "What are you talking about? There is only blackness out there. Where is the barrier?" "A normal barrier would have to be seen as a haze, distorting light as it travelled through it. This did not look like a barrier." Matsusu Shiruna turned around again and looked up at Lord Tokunodo and said, "My lord, it is a black barrier. No, I think it's even more. A perfect mirror barrier. I've never seen one so large, but that's what we are seeing now." For the first time in this long 2-year war, Lord Tokunodo felt a feeling of hope and stood up. He quickly quashed it. He could not afford to have any hope. He simply had to, without thinking, struggle to his best of his abilities against the Demon Lord. Hope would weaken him, and he could not afford that. For some reason he visualised a fox in a trap attempting to gnarl away his legs so he could escape. Unfortunately for Lord Tokunodo and his people, not even that option was available. Lord Tokunodo then sat back in his seat and said, "In that case, get the barrier sorceresses ready in case the barrier should fail again." But while he quashed his feeling of hope, he wondered, was there a powerful ally who had come at the last moment to save all in the city? He shook his head. What stupidity. That only occurred in fairy tales, not in real life. It must be some terrible weapon of the Demon Lord, and he must make sure he was ready as possible to meet it. But based on what he saw before him, that made as little sense as a magical ally which arrived in the nick of time. Matsusu Shiruna stood up and moved next to the seated Lord Tokunodo and whispered, "Matsusu Shinoda sent us that warning. She must know what is happening, but I'm unable to communicate with her." Matsusu Shinoda thought Lord Tokunodo. Why was she sending us a warning? Did she have the power of seeing the future? None of this made any sense. Nothing made sense, but one thing he knew. He was alive, and so were most of the sorceresses in the command centre. And where there was life, there was always the ability to fight. During this period of respite from attack, the defenders in the command centre hurried to prepare for further attack, or to rest. They revived some of the barrier sorceresses who had slipped into a light coma, and they were now resting normally. The blinded screen sorceresses were being made attended to, but the medical sorceresses could do little for their eyesight. Somehow they had been fully blinded. In fact, most of the screen sorceresses saw lights in their eyes, but this at least was rapidly dissipating for those who were not fully blind. Then, after what seemed like an eternity but could only be 10 minutes, another message was sent. "Take cover. The heat will be intense and may cause fires." This was repeated 2 more times, and the amazing barrier disappeared. Lord Tokunodo looked at the viewer and his jaws dropped. His only surviving son was out there among what he saw. Oh, please, let him be safe, he thought. Part 3. The Wall. The commander, who happened to be the only surviving son of Lord Tokunodo, looked over the wall at the hordes of the demons or Lord's army. At the moment, they were all held back by the barrier, or at least most were. Every now and then one of the horde managed to get through. In these cases, his archers quickly dealt with them. When the barrier wall failed, he would have more than his archers could handle. He looked at his left at some of his men. They all looked scared, but they would not run. He knew they were all good men, and regardless, where would you run to? Better to fight and die than be caught, tortured, and led then to die. He checked his men on the right, and then turned to his aide. How are the arrows supplied? I want to make sure each man has at least 20 arrows at all times. He figured they could fire that many before the ladders were up and they needed to draw their swords. His aides replied, "Done, Commander, we have more than enough arrows." The commander then glanced back at the enemy, and then he heard the warning in his mind. On a count of 30, do not look to the north for a count of 10, otherwise you will be blinded. The commander thought the message was strange, but it came from a sorceress of Tokia, so after waiting for 20 seconds, he shouted to his men, "Do not look to the north until I tell you to look back." He then turned to his aide, "Make sure the men obey and do not look to the north." The aide nodded and hurried off down the line to make sure the men had their backs to the wall. After 10 more seconds, the brilliant flash of light hit the wall. Even though he was looking at the city, enough light reflected off stone walls and wooden roofs to dazzle him. He blinked many times until the brightness had subsided. What in the hell was that, he thought. The light was so bright he had forgotten to count to 10. He decided to play it safe. Whatever that was, if he was looking at it, he knew he would be instantly blinded. After what seemed again like an eternity, he received another message. If outside, take cover. While he was behind a wall, he was most certainly outside. He shouted, "Take cover, take cover!" His men were already cowering behind the wall, and most had no intention of standing up. But then the roar reached them. They had never heard anything like it. It was like the largest waterfall that they had ever heard, many times louder. The men pressed their hands to their ears until the roar had subsided, and then the wind hit. The intense, hot, horrible wind. Oh my God, the commander thought. Even behind the wall, the heat was so intense he could feel he could not take much more. Then suddenly it grew darker and darker until it was pitch black. He was panicking now, but at least the wind, that terrible wind, had stopped. After a moment, he felt it was safe to stand and looked over the wall. The enemy were dazed and many had fallen over, but they were picking themselves up and some were moving towards the wall. The shield was down, he thought. Men, get up and fire at any of those who come too close. Some men got up and started firing at the enemy, which were advancing, but most of his men were too dazed to do anything. Luckily, the enemy were even in a worse state. Most were looking at the castle, so were not blinded, but they did experience the reflected light, which did temporarily blind them. Then they heard the unholy roar and were hit by the intensely hot wind. Those at the rear were burned and lay screaming, but they shielded those to the front. Behind the lines of burning, screaming enemy was nothing. Nothing at all, just blackness. After a while the commander could see some lights in it, but it really made absolutely no sense. Nothing made sense. "All up! Prepare your bows, but only fire at enemy which move closer than 50 metres, he shouted. No point in wasting arrows. At 50 metres all the arrows would find a target, and while the enemy crossed that space in at least 20 arrows could be loosened. "Get up, you lazy worms, get up," he shouted. His aide had returned and moved down the other flank, prodding those men too scared to get up with his swagger stick. Get up, get up. Do you want to die quivering like a little girl?" he shouted. It was at least 10 minutes before his men had managed to assemble and prepare themselves. But the enemy was not advancing. Then another message in his head. "Take cover, the heat will be intense and may cause fire." The commander shouted again, "Quickly, everyone take cover, take cover." Just as he dropped behind the wall, the black shield disappeared. This was it, he thought. Behind the shield were thousands of demon lord soldiers, all wanting to kill me and my troops, and they would almost certainly succeed. But when he looked over the wall, what he saw shocked him. Behind the black shield was hell. It was the only word which described what he saw. There were no enemy soldiers, no equipment, no trees, no houses, nothing. Just a flat, barren, glowing ground. When the heat hit him, it was not a hot wind. This was pure, radiant heat. Where it was coming from, he thought. Where was it coming from? But when he saw the glowing ground, he understood. It was the ground. The ground was almost red hot, and the heat from it was assaulting him. The reaction from the enemy was horrible to behold. Those close to the shield wall erupted in flames, or at least their clothes did. The enemy threw their weapons down and ran to the wall screaming, "We surrender, we surrender." The commander then shouted to his men, "Do not fire, do not fire." Some troops had let off some arrows, but most were in such a shock state they were not able to. No matter how evil his enemy was, no one deserved to die like this. He went to the rear of the rampart and shouted down, open the gate, and let them in without any weapons. Make sure they are well guarded." It took a while for the large gate to open, but when it did, a steady stream of grateful goblins, orcs and trolls came in. None had weapons. Most were burned, but all grateful and shouting, "We surrender, we surrender." The commander screamed to his aide, "Get more men from the militia to guard the prisoner." The aide, about 20 metres down the wall, looked at the commander and responded, "Yes, sir." He then quickly disappeared down the ladder to get the militia as ordered. On the wall, the commander then looked at his men and shouted twice, once to the left and the other to the right, "Keep an eye open. If you see anyone with a weapon, I want that person dead." Most of the men responded, and with bows ready, watching at the horde of screaming, dying and terrified enemy. The commander looked down and could only say, "This is truly hell." And then he looked in the distance and saw the mighty mushroom-shaped cloud reach to the sky and gasped, "Hell on earth!" Hell on earth was all he could think. Part 4. Mashutsu shi Noda. Lord Tokonado was staring at the viewing screen, and all the sorceresses were alert and ready to bring up the barrier the moment they detected any attack from the Demon Lord, but none came. They waited thus for almost 30 minutes when Mashutsu shi Noda arrived. Lord Tokonado was still staring at the viewing screen, at that terrible cloud, when Mashutsu shi Noda walked into the command centre. It had taken her almost 20 minutes to climb down the stairs to reach the room, and apart from breathing slightly more than the person at rest would do, she was otherwise calm. "Lord Tokonado, the Demon Lord and his army, is destroyed." She stared over the gap between the door and the commander's chair. "The war is not ended, but the city is safe and the Demon Lord is dead." Lord Tokonado turned to look at Noda and thought, what an understatement. The Demon Lord and his army is not just defeated, it's vaporized. Majutsu shi Runa, standing next to Lord Tokonoto, turned to face Majutsu shi Noda and demanded, "What is this? What do you know? What has happened?" In a normal circumstance, when the leader of all the sorceresses addressed you as such, you would quiver in fear, but not Majutsu shi Noda. She was not intimidated, nor fearful, only as calm as a still pond. "It is, as I have stated. The battle is won and we must prepare for what comes now," calmly Majutsu shi Noda stated. Majutsu shi Runa looked flustered and was about to speak when Lord Tokonado placed his hand on her shoulder. This stopped Majutsu shi Runa, and she dropped her head. "Please, Majutsu shi Noda, tell us what you can, as we know not what has occurred," Lord Tokonado asked in a soft and pleading voice. He wanted to so much believe this was true, but was still wary. "I do not fully understand what has occurred, but I will say what I know, even if I do not fully understand it. Lady Eva of Klagenfurt gained a powerful form of magic and created the light and cloud you see in the screen before you. She also created the reflective barrier to protect our city from its effect. I could tell this to you in the words she would use, but they would have no meaning to me or yourself." Majutsu shi Noda then paused and waited for further questions. "Where is Lady Eva of Klagenfurt? If what you have said is true, we owe her our thanks." "No, we owe her everything," Lord Tokonado asked. Majutsu shi Noda sighed, shrugged her shoulders, and with a downward glaze said, "It is true, every word, and Eva is gone. She consumed her very essence to do what she has done. She sacrificed herself for our sakes, and I know not why. With her power she could have left the city in perfect safety, but she did not." Lord Tokonado waited for a moment, then turned to Majutsu shi Runa. "Can you ask the viewing sorceresses to check for enemies around the city? Please go as far as you can, as we can clearly see none has survived within view of the city." Majutsu shi Runa reluctantly nodded and began to instruct the viewing sorceresses accordingly. Lord Tokonado then turned back to Majutsu shi Noda and asked, Do you have any understanding of the magic Lady Eva used and how she was able to do it? Majutsu Shinoda turned up to face the Lord Tokunaga with a look of panic, or was it fear? No, we must never try to pursue that path. The magic used is evil, pure evil, and can only cause the destruction of our entire world if we pursue it. The answer is no. Lord Tokunaga was surprised at the reply, but did notice that Noda did not say she did not know of the magic, only not to pursue it. Could Majutsu Shinoda still be mad or affected of what occurred when Eva arrived? He thought it best not to push this point too far. He changed the conversation. Will the heat go away? When can things return to some level of normalcy? Majutsu Shinoda seemed calmer now. The lake of molten granite will remain too hot to approach for many years, but most of the land around it will begin to rapidly cool. The south pass should be passable in a few days, the north perhaps a few months. I am uncertain. Lord Tokunaga touched his chin and thought that there will be much to be done. Feed the people, reorganise the armies, find new homes for those who have lost their homes, and most importantly, decide what to do next. He needed to recapture the half of the kingdom occupied by the lead Demon Lord, and while the forces of the Demon Lord were but a fraction of their previous size, this will still require a lot of fighting. He thought perhaps 2 more years of fighting. While he was not happy that the war was going to continue, now for the first time in 2 years, he finally allowed the feeling of hope to wash over him, and it felt so good. Part 5. This must never happen again. The meeting chambers were again in turmoil. None seemed to be able to agree to anything, Lord Tokunaga thought. Silence, silence, shouted the Master-at-Arms, after which the attendees began to calm down. Lord Tokunaga sighed once again. The first order to attend to is what to do with this offer of peace from the new Demon Lord. I need some advice, some useful advice, not this uncivilized shouting. Let us begin with the barons of the south. As I understand, you speak as one. The baron from the largest city in the south rose. Thank you, my lord. We in the south wish to accept the peace offering. It returns our lands, provides some compensation, avoids more bloodshed. He then sat down. Lord Tokunaga nodded. A logical course of action, he thought. Then he turned to the representatives of the northern barriers. What say you? While none had any cities, they were all occupied by the Demon Lord. They represented the people who had managed to escape. My lord, we have lost much. The compensation is trifling compared to the damages and loss of life in our cities. I say we must crush the Demon Lord once and for all. Do not accept the peace treaty and use this opportunity to crush them finally. He then sat down. Lord Tokunaga nodded at this reply. Another logical course of action, he thought. The issue is what to decide. He then turned to the last representative of the table, his surviving son. However, he knew he represented Majutsu Shinoda, and his words would be those of that accursed sorceress. He did not know how it occurred, but while the lands cooled, she had managed to gain the support of most of the army, and in a grudging manner the people of the north. This was not what sorceresses were supposed to do. They had a privileged position and in return allowed the men to deal with matters such as politics. He was not saying that what she said was without worth. It was not what she was supposed to do. She sat in the chamber, invited by his son. Lord Tokunaga then turned to his son and asked, as a representative of the army, what say you? Lord Tokunaga's son Yasu rose and turned to all the representatives of the tables and started speaking. First, we must all agree what has occurred should never be allowed to occur again. If accepting the peace offered can be done while achieving this objective, then I say accept it. However, I do not see how that is possible. The northern barons all murmured assent, as did the military commanders. Only the southern barons looked unhappy. Once we agree with this, there are only 2 ways of ensuring this never occurs again. The first is the total elimination of the Demon Lord's people, race and all his allies who stay loyal. Once again the northern barons grunted their approvals, but no others did. The second is we make our former enemies our friends, but only after total unconditional surrender. It was this which caused uproar. The The northern barons saw nothing wrong with unconditional surrender, but why make them our friends? Kill them all was their stated objective. The southern barons saw nothing wrong with making them our friends, but saw no need to demand unconditional surrender, which would only surely result in more bloodshed. The army commanders said nothing. "Silence, silence," shouted the master-at-arms again, after which the attendees finally began to calm down again. Lord Tokunaga faced his son. "I understand your first course of action, but the second leaves me puzzled. Why make them friends, and how can we guarantee they will remain friends?" Lord Tokunaga's son Yasu looked back at his father. "After we have totally defeated them and hold them totally in our power, if we show mercy, they will most certainly become our most loyal friends. It is human and also inhuman nature. As for guarantee, one condition is they would adopt our tradition of ensuring the population does not exceed the carrying capacity of the lands they occupied. They may initially resent it, but it's a small price to pay, and when they see the benefits, they will even display more loyalty." Lord Tokunaga waited for the moment, and then asked, "If we select the first, how should we assure that they've eliminated everyone?" Lord Tokunaga sat back, sighed, and then replied, "Those who wish revenge will be required to settle in the territories to ensure they hunt down and kill every last demon, woman and child." He then looked at the barons of the north. "I'm sure, good sire, you would be happy to make your homes in the Goblin Forest to ensure your revenge." The northern barons glared back, but they knew they were that was not an attractive prospect, and remained quiet. The southern baron representative stood. "I still say accept the peace treaty," and then sat down. Lord Tokunaga's son looked in that direction of the baron and said, "Those who wish to accept the peace treaty clearly have no concerns of the demon lord's army coming back, so they should be allowed to settle in the north, and the northern barons allowed to stay in the south, where they are now. How say you?" Now it was the turn of the southern barons to glare back, but he knew that was not something they wished. They remained silent. Lord Tokunaga was impressed. How did his son learn these arguing skills? He eliminated opposition from both set of barons with a clever condition. He now looked at his army commanders and said, "What say you?" The highest ranked commander stood. "You know our answer. We will accept what is decided by yourself." He then sat down, looking nervous. Lord Tokunaga knew he was not truthful. He also knew they would follow whatever Matsutsushi Noda agreed with, and he'd better make sure he did not cause their loyalties to be tested. He stood. "In that case, my decision is to reject the peace treaty and adopt the second strategy, unconditional surrender and mercy. What say you all?" Once again a commotion occurred, but after it died down they all agreed. The war was to continue, perhaps for many more years, but if there was one thing he agreed with, this must never happen again. This concludes chapter 5 and the entire story so far. There may even be a sequel. My Japanese pronunciation is not very good, so in apologies to my Japanese speakers, すみません。私の日本語やよくありません。ありがとうございました。